Thank you, Parker. I heard you. I heard everybody else a little bit too. Brother John's always good to brag on song leaders when he gets up to preach, and I'll take just a second to say, you call him Brother Roger, I call him Papa, but he's a song leader extraordinaire. I think probably one of the most impactful song leaders in our area and one of the greatest to ever do it. It's just an honor to me when I get to preach, and he's singing. That just means a lot to me. And earlier, as he just led us so beautifully in that Beauty for Ashes song, and talking about the promise of God that was given in Isaiah, it made me think of the first slide of this lesson that I was going to put up about this idea of grief and pain, right? Beauty for ashes is a great promise because we live now with the ashes, don't we? The ashes, the trouble, the death, the misery, the grief, and the pain. Those are things that we're familiar with. We don't need explanation for those things. We understand that we live in a sad world, a world of suffering, and we all experience grief and pain, and because of that, we all want, if I can turn my clicker on here so that I can advance the slide. Well, maybe I can. That button is more stuck than it's ever been. There it goes. All right. We all live with grief and pain, and so because of that, we all want and crave comfort and compassion. We want to be comforted for all of the bad things that are going on in our life. And as we've said, God offers that comfort. But as I've heard it said before, maybe by a young child, I'm glad that God loves me, but sometimes you just need somebody with some skin, right? Somebody to give you a hug, somebody to put that hand on your back and be there for you. And so we all want those things. And you could kind of sum it up in this idea of the word sympathy. We all want sympathy in our life. It's something that we need. We need people to sympathize with us. And speaking of the sympathy that God gives, we had it read earlier, that one who put on flesh, who had skin, but was also God in the flesh. We think about our Lord Jesus Christ in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Jesus as our high priest exists to show us that not only does God know us, not only did he make us, but also he cares for us. He has sympathy on us. He can understand Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, God made man. He can sympathize with our weaknesses. He isn't so far removed that he can't understand what it's like to go through those temptations. And of course, we're thankful that he did so without sin. But when we look at that word sympathize there, it's the word that shows up in most every translation, except really for one, and I don't mean to pick on the NIV, though it does have several issues, but the NIV translates it this way: for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. Now, you may say, well, that doesn't seem like too much of a difference. I understand what's being said in both, and of course we can. But it brings up this question of kind of the sympathy versus empathy debate. Now, those two words sound almost exactly alike, don't they? They're very similar words, and if you had to kind of give an answer, well, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy, you may struggle to do so. But if you kind of peek around a little bit and look, I went to Merriam-Webster. You always go to the dictionary first, I guess. And on their article, first thing that came up on Google, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? They say this: sympathy is a feeling of sincere concern for someone who is experiencing something difficult or painful. And that's a good definition, isn't it? We have a feeling of concern for them, sincere concern, it even says, for a person who is going through some sort of painful, difficult situation. Below that, it says empathy involves actively sharing in the person's emotional experience. Most of the time I've heard it put this way: sympathy is being sorry for someone, empathy is being sorry with someone, maybe something along those lines. But what's interesting is in recent times, especially in modern debates of philosophy and of grief counseling and things like that, there's kind of been this uneven nature to this debate of sympathy versus empathy. Several people are saying, well, sympathy is the lesser, empathy is the greater of these two things. In fact, Brene Brown, we'll be looking at more from her later in this lesson. She's an academic, an author, a podcaster, and all these different things. She speaks about empathy, and she says empathy fuels connection, but sympathy drives disconnection. Now note the difference from Merriam-Webster to her. Merriam-Webster said sympathy is this sincere concern, but Brown says no. Empathy is what connects us, and sympathy actually disconnects us. Well, what does she mean by that? She's obviously kind of creating this uneven nature between the two, and even maybe saying that sympathy is a negative thing. And so on goes the debate about empathy. And so tonight, I want to talk just for a minute about this sort of debate of empathy versus sympathy, and the question, should empathy rule the day? Should empathy be what we ultimately have as Christians? As Christians, we're called to care for others, to care for each other in this building, to care for those outside of the church. So what should we do with empathy versus sympathy? Well, a question that could be asked is, what does empathy actually mean? When we're coming down to it, we have what Merriam-Webster says. We obviously have other opinions, and empathy can be really defined any number of ways. Maybe some of these came to mind for you. Empathy can mean knowing another's thoughts and feelings, adopting the posture of another, actually feeling as another does, maybe imagining how one would feel or think in another's place, feeling distress at another's suffering, or projecting oneself into another's situation. And again, it comes back to this question, and I'm so sorry, I meant to check this before I got up here, and then time kind of eluded me. But what this says is the empathy versus sympathy debate a lot of times comes down to feeling for someone versus feeling with someone. Which one is it, and which one should we go after? The funny thing about this is we already have a word that we have in the English language that really stands in for feeling with someone, and it's this word sympathy that we've been using throughout the lesson so far. This word, it comes from two Greek ideas. One is the stem there, and it means with. And then you have pathos, which means to feel or suffer. And so literally sympathy means to suffer with. Now, again, we just looked at earlier the common idea that sympathy is to kind of care for, concern for, whereas empathy is concern with. But no, right there in sympathy, the idea of suffer with exists in that word. That's the Greek word. The Latin word is compassion. Compassion. It comes from, again, the com stem in Latin, which means with, and passio, which means to suffer. So again, you have the same idea. Suffer with. Sympathy, compassion both mean to suffer with. And suffering with is a Christian idea at its very core. We have multiple verses in the Bible that command us to suffer with or feel with others. Of course, we know Romans chapter 12, verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8 in the New King James Version says, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. There's that compassion, suffer with. If we looked at the ESV, we would see the word sympathy used interchangeably. You see the two words mean the same thing. And so we must suffer with, we must feel for our brothers and sisters in Christ. We must, again, rejoice with one another and also weep with one another. But the reason that we do that is not just because God says, well, I want you to be nice. It's actually an aspect of the nature of God himself. We think about Psalm 34, verse 18, the Lord is near to those who have a broken heart and saves such as have a contrite spirit. So God shows sympathy and compassion to those who are hurting, to those who have the broken heart, to those who feel that pain. God is near to them. And he saves those people, and because God is near to them, we should be near to them as well. And so if we were to look at the list of the meanings of the word empathy, you would see really several that we could really go, okay, those are just what the Bible tells us to do. So I don't really understand what the issue with the word empathy then is. What would be the problem with the idea of empathy or feeling, again, that intense kinship of a person's emotions? And you see, I've underlined most everything here except for the ideas of actually feeling as another does, or maybe projecting oneself into another's situation. You know, we understand that idea of suffering with somebody. We have biblical examples of that. I think maybe foremost about Job's friends. in Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. Job's friends wanted to comfort Job. They had heard all that had happened to him, and they said, we need to go and be with Job. Well, how did they do that? And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Did Job's friends have compassion on him? They did. Did they sympathize with him? They did. Now we know later they spoke things that hurt Job and things that weren't in accordance with the will of God. But for a time, they literally came and sat silently with Job. Was that an easy thing to do? It's not easy for me to keep my mouth shut for 5 minutes. Can you imagine being silent for 7 days in a row, knowing that nothing that they could say was really going to help him? But when I think of that idea of empathy, the one that we usually carry, that hurting with somebody, this is sort of what I think about. But as we've already looked at, sympathy and compassion already include that idea of suffering with somebody. So what separates empathy? Well, empathy, funny enough, if you want to go back and say, well, what were people saying about empathy 2,000 years ago? They weren't saying anything about empathy 2,000 years ago. They weren't saying anything about empathy 500 years ago, because empathy wasn't even a word until about 100 years ago, which is interesting, isn't it? It's a relatively new word. So that always piques my interest when I go, well, why did we make a new word? Was there something we need to make a word for? And it kind of came along with a lot of weird artistic German movements back again about 100, maybe a little bit more than 100 years ago. And it really meant something different than what people use it to mean now. But if we were going to break down the word empathy, just like we did with the other two, we would see that empathy comes from the Greek stem em, which means in, and then that pathos, which means to feel or suffer. So literally, empathy is to suffer in. Suffer in, not suffer with. That's sympathy, and that's compassion. But empathy is to suffer in. Well, what does that look like? Well, let's think about the example, right? Here's you, and it could be you or it could be me, and there is suffering happening in your life. You are going through a difficult time. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you're going through a divorce. Maybe any number of terrible things could be happening, and you are suffering. Well, I'm going to come in alongside of you, and my intention is to comfort you. I see that you're going in a direction of pain, and I say, well, I want to show comfort and love and sympathy and compassion, and that's literally what that picture there is. It's sympathy, right? I'm coming in, and I'm showing you comfort while you are going through suffering. Now, the picture is different, though, if we want to have that literal definition idea of empathy. Empathy is the idea that you are suffering, and I'm going to come into your suffering there and join you, and now we're both suffering. I'm suffering alongside of you. I'm feeling what you are feeling. And that idea, again, is literally what exists in the word empathy. I'm suffering with you. It's that your pain has become my pain. Our emotions have become one, and we're feeling that together. Now, stay with me here, and I'll kind of show you how that works out, at least how people think about it today. But what it's ultimately led to is this idea, especially in the world of therapy, of counseling, that empathy is greater than sympathy. Sympathy is just going, well, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. That really stinks. I can't imagine. I hate that you're going through that. And empathy is going, no. I understand you, and I hurt with the same pain you hurt with, and I'm hurting with that pain right now too. And that's what empathy is supposed to be. And if that's the case, the question is, what then would be the issue with empathy? Why am I even talking about it? Well, the reason is because things surrounding this conversation have changed kind of slowly over recent years, and I think it's worth thinking about and talking about. Like, again, I apologize, that's hard to read. But the first reason is shifting definitions have started taking place in this conversation. The flag there that you can't see says, practice radical empathy. Practice radical empathy. Well, what is radical empathy? I found this website. It's for a camp that is focused on kind of discipling young minds. They're not a religious camp, but I'll use disciple because they're trying to teach these kids a certain mindset around the way they live their life. And this camp was focused on instilling radical empathy within children. And note what it says: radical empathy is actively striving to better understand and share the feelings of others. We understand that along with the definition we've been talking about. To fundamentally change our perspectives from judgmental to accepting in an attempt to more authentically connect with ourselves and others. You notice the shift that happens there. This empathy is not just about helping somebody who is suffering maybe, but we're looking at someone who feels that they have been wronged in some way. And what we're going to do with radical empathy is we're going to change our perspective from judging to accepting. Do you already kind of have the dog whistle going off in your ear around that? We're now accepting this person's set of ideas or beliefs or thoughts about their pain. We're accepting that, and we're not going to have any sort of judgment. Now remember, judgment doesn't just mean judging harshly in a situation. Judgment means looking at a situation and making some calls about what's good and what's bad. Correct? Do we do that in situations? Imagine, again, somebody comes up to us on the street and they say, "I'm so sorry, I don't want to bother you, but I haven't eaten I haven't eaten in a week, and if you'll just give me a $100 bill, I'll go on my way and get something to eat." Now, empathy, radical empathy, says this person's asked for a $100 bill. I've got one in my wallet. They're hungry. What do? I'm not supposed to judge. I just accept their situation and I go on about my business, right? But can we use judgment in a situation like that? Could we look at the person asking us and see if we note anything about them that might make us question whether we should hand them a $100 bill carte blanche and say, "Here you go, just do whatever you want with it"? I would say so. But radical empathy says, no. We have to change our perspective from judgment to acceptance. We just have to accept whatever this person is telling me is going on with them and what they need. They go on to talk about this idea of emotional empathy, or sharing the feelings of others, also called affective sympathy or empathy, or primitive empathy. And that's another where your alarm should be going off, because ultimately what they don't say here is they're trying to teach you that primitive means your monkey brain had this kind of empathy before society ruined it, right? So this kind of empathy, they say, is the subjective state resulting from emotional contagion. Now, they use that word positively. It sounds scary to me, emotional contagion. What they mean is the automatic drive to respond appropriately to others' emotions. This kind of empathy happens automatically and often unconsciously. And that idea of emotional contagion is whatever you are feeling almost infects my brain, and I'm going to feel it automatically. I should feel the way that you feel without any kind of judgment, without any kind of thought. I'm just going to automatically feel that way, and that's what they're trying to foster again in these young children. Well, what do? You get a shifting definition with this, because what we've been talking about in the first sense was empathy for emotion, right? You're hurting and I want to understand how you feel. But where this boat ultimately ends up is we're now shifting to empathy for worldview. Right? You have to empathize with my view of the world, my view of my situation. Now, again, we live in a victimized culture, don't we? Everybody's a victim. Everybody's been oppressed. And radical empathy says when we see that person and they have an idea of how they've been oppressed, how they've been made a victim, we have to have empathy for their worldview. Never mind the worldview, again, of all the religions of the world, all of the various philosophies of the world. That's included too. We've shifted to that definition, and what this ultimately means is we have to have acceptance of their worldview. We have to capitulate and say, no, whatever you believe about the world, whatever you believe about yourself, that's what I'm going to believe too, because that's what radical empathy is. Another issue with empathy is this. Empathy, ultimately in the world sense, it means equality at all costs. Okay? We are going to be equal no matter what. Let me show you what this means. Here's the picture of sympathy that we had earlier, right? In sympathy, you are suffering and I am coming alongside you and comforting you. But some philosophers and counselors and psychologists have looked at this and says, no, this picture is actually bad. And the reason this picture is bad is because of this. Do you see that space in between you and me? That's what they would call differentiation. That means you're suffering, and I am coming alongside and comforting you, and that means that there is a space between us, or even a gasp, as they often call it, a power dynamic. Now, again, that's a buzzword nowadays, but power dynamic usually has to do with an oppressor and a victim. But here what power dynamic means is this. You are the hurt person, and I am the comforting person, so I'm putting myself above you. Right? You're hurt, and I'm coming in to fix your problem, is what they assume that all comforters are doing. And if I'm coming in to fix your problem, then I'm creating a power dynamic. And that's why Brene Brown said earlier, empathy fuels connection, sympathy drives disconnection. In other words, if I don't empathize with somebody's idea about who they are, their identity, their beliefs, what's been done to them, if I don't empathize with that, then I am creating a disconnection with them. That would be sympathy, she says. Sympathy is disconnecting us because I may come in and say, well, I want to comfort this person. Again, the homeless person comes up and you say, well, I'm not going to give you a $100 bill, but I will drive you to Burger King and I'll buy you a Whopper. I'll buy you as much food as you need. Let's go and get it. Well, that's sympathy, and that's not good enough. That's driving disconnection because, again, you're creating a power dynamic there. What you ought to do is empathize and say, no, you're right, I'll give you whatever you want. Now, that sounds silly, but that's the difference in definition that is being used here. And again, Brown's outlook, it was noted in the study, she notes that empathy is a skill that can bring people together and make people feel included, while sympathy creates an uneven power dynamic and can lead to more isolation and disconnection. As they did this study, they said, if you look in the recent years at all the politicians and the philosophers and the people up on the stage, they have quotes from President Obama and others, they all note how empathy is really what we're missing in this world. Empathy, the lack of it's the problem. We need to have more empathy for more people and their beliefs and their worldviews. And when you go against this grain is when you start getting called all of these things, right? Oh, well, you're just a sexist. Well, you're just a racist. Well, you hate gay people. You're just closed-minded. And what it all comes back to is you won't empathize and accept the worldview of those who, again, feel differently than you do about something. And it's funny because it kind of comes down to this idea that you can't understand me unless you feel exactly like I do. That's empathy. You have to feel with me, feel like I do. And unless you do, you can't understand me. But what's so funny is the opposite side of the coin, what they will tell you in the next breath is, you can never understand me because you could never feel the way I do. You see the difference there? We're told on one hand, well, you can't understand unless you feel the way I do. And on the other hand, we're told you can never feel the way that I do. Well, with this comes several assumptions, okay? And we want to be careful with this. But there are assumptions that are being made under this radical empathy. Number one is the idea that the hurt person knows what is best to remedy their issues. Is that always true? Is it always true that a hurt person who, again, needs sympathy knows what is best for them in their situation? There was a situation that I was a part of not too long ago where I was talking to someone and dialoguing with them, and they had been through a terrible situation and were very hurt, but when I listened to what they were saying, I realized that they did not have their best interest in mind. Now, that's not surprising because they had been through so much and it was a traumatic experience. But on the other side of it, we have to realize that the world is saying, no, you have to do whatever they say. You have to capitulate to whatever demands they have. They're the victim. They're the hurt person. Folks, that is not wise. That's not wise in the least. But that's the assumption being made. Again, the other assumption is the main source of pain comes from others disagreeing with the hurt person's feelings. That's why all the time we have people saying trans people are constantly being murdered. Transgender people are being murdered every day. What that really means is every day people are telling transgender people that they don't agree with their worldview. That's considered murder. It's considered murder to disagree with somebody's idea of their feelings and the pain that they hold. And again, the final assumption is that it's the responsibility of the comforter to believe and affirm the hurt person in whatever they believe. And as we would look at it, and we looked at that situation as it played out, we would see that that is not always what the person needs. In fact, rarely is that what the hurt person actually needs. Joe Rigney is another academic and author, and he noted this difference about empathy and sympathy. He said, because empathy under certain definitions is an emotive connection closely tied to the immediate feelings of the hurting, it can tend to be more reactive. That's the word I want to focus on there. Empathy is reactive. I see this person crying, I see the person walk up to me, and they're telling me something, and I'm just going to react and go, okay, well, whatever they say, that's what I'm going to do. But sympathy, on the other hand, he says, because it is fundamentally concerned with the overall good of the person who is suffering, is more responsive. Is there a difference between reactive and responsive? There is, isn't there? One just says, this is what happens, so I'm going to just do something and react to it. But sympathy is responsive and is thus able to take sober-minded and carefully considered action to address others' pain. What he's saying there, again, is sympathy ultimately goes, I want what is best for this person. Empathy generally is focused on, I want to stop this person's feelings from hurting as quickly as I possibly can. And those are different things. It's different to say, I want what's best for somebody, and to say, well, I want them to stop hurting as soon as they can. Sometimes more hurt is what's on the way to healing, isn't it? Sometimes more hurt and the truth is what stands between them and kind of coming to peace with that. And it's something we ought to think of. But third, the reason I would watch out for is the goal of sympathy versus the goal of empathy. I want you to imagine that you have somebody who is stuck in quicksand. Now, I know when I was a kid and watched cartoons, I thought there was going to be quicksand around every corner of the world, right? And I've yet to come into contact with some, but I'm told that quicksand does exist. It is out there. And I want you to imagine the idea that somebody is stuck in quicksand. Now, I want to insert you or me into that situation. I want you first to imagine that you are standing afar off, you are looking over the way, you see somebody in the quicksand, they're yelling, help, I've fallen into quicksand, I need help. You're standing over here, and guess what? You just don't care. And that's a danger. There could be a situation where you say, well, I was on my way to Cracker Barrel or McDonald's, and I can't really be troubled to stop. I don't know who that is. Something might happen to me. I'm not going to help them. That would be what we call apathy. Now, we haven't mentioned that so far, but we've talked about sympathy, empathy. You also have apathy. No suffering. I'm not going to suffer with this person or whatever. I'm going to stay away from them. And there is the concept that maybe instead of wanting to hurt the person, we would have apathy and not want to help them at all. And we'll talk in just a moment about why that isn't an option for the Christian. But now instead, I want you to think about the empathetic, the radical empathetic response to helping this person. And that, of course, would be to jump both feet in to the quicksand with them. Okay? I'm going to be empathetic with this person. I'm going to suffer with them. And so I'm going to take both feet and I'm going to jump into the quicksand so I can have empathy with the quicksand victim. Does that work? Why doesn't it work? Well, now there are two quicksand victims, right? Now we've got two people that are hurting, and nobody is any closer to help, are they? I'm empathetic. I've jumped where they are. I've gone down to their level. There's no power dynamic anymore. There's no person outside and one person under. No, we're both in it, and that is what radical empathy looks for. It brings everybody down to that same level. Well, the problem is the ultimate goal is not to help that person's feelings that are hurt that goes, I bet I'm the only person who's ever jumped into quicksand. Well, now you're not. Now there's two of us, right? That's not what they need. What do they need? To be out of the quicksand. So let's now put ourselves back in the middle on the shore, right? We're here. We've seen this person in quicksand. We know they need help, but we're going to do something very callous. Before we help them, we are going to take a moment. We're going to look at the situation. We're going to make a judgment. We're going to find some kind of short stump nearby. And, of course, maybe we have some rope in our pocket. It's my illustration. It can be whatever I want it to be. We have rope in our pocket, and we're going to tie ourselves to that stump. We've now tethered ourselves, haven't we? Now what can we do with that person? Now that we're tethered and we're not going to fall in. We can help them, right? Now, there is differentiation there. There is a space between us. They're suffering, and I'm not suffering the same suffering as them. But even so, I can actually help them more from where I am. With all the compassion, with all the sympathy in the world. But that's what that person needs, and that's what sympathy really is. It's grounded concern and comfort. This was a story in the New York Times. It said a man falls into quicksand and comes out with a girlfriend. Apparently, somewhere along the way in the rescue effort, he met a woman and he got a girlfriend out of it. But what I liked was the picture that you see this man waist deep in quicksand, but you don't have the other guy running in to get him. You have someone standing up, and he's got a wire pulling him out. Right? That's what sympathy is. It's that grounded concern and comfort. And again, that's what people most of the time need. Now, the way you're going to do that's going to differ. It's not always a fixable situation. We don't go into the funeral home and say, let me sit down here and tell you how to fix your grief. That's not what I'm talking about there. I'm talking about that worldly idea that for empathy to really rule the day, we have to get down on people's level, not try to help them at all, but rather just capitulate to their beliefs, agree with them, and make them feel heard. That isn't always the best thing to do. Case in point, let's look at some biblical examples. Going back to Job in Job chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, then Job's wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Had Job's wife lost everything that Job had lost? She had. Had she lost all of her children? Had she lost all of the belongings? Was she going through suffering and pain as well? Of course she was. Job should have been empathetic with her when she said, why do you still do this? Curse God and die. The empathetic thing is to say, you're right, curse God, I'm done with him. Is that what Job did? No. Job said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Was that callous? It hurt. You think that hurt her? I'm sure that it did. But that was sympathy because Job was concerned for her ultimate well-being. He was not going to empathize and say, no, you're right. What you believe is true. I'm with you 100% of the way. We're going to do this. He said, no. You need to understand the road that you're going down. That's not how we're going to think about this. That was sympathy. That was the godly notion. Think about John chapter 11. Jesus has gotten news that his friend Lazarus is sick. And in fact, he's been told this sickness is so bad, we don't know that he's going to make it. When Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Note, Jesus says, number one, this sickness doesn't lead to death. It's going to be for the glory of God. Number two, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, because he loved them, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Is that what the loving thing to do was? What Mary and Martha wanted was Jesus come now and heal him while he's still alive, get the sickness over with so he can continue living. But Jesus loved them, and so what did he do? He delayed. Because what did he know? What was ultimately going to be better for them and for the entire world was for Lazarus to pass and then Jesus to raise him from the dead. Did Jesus Christ have sympathy on Mary and Martha? More than you and I could ever have in our entire existence. He loved them more than we ever could, but we see he did the sympathetic thing, not necessarily the empathetic thing. And then again in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, note Paul here. Paul was someone who constantly was trying to put himself in other people's shoes. Paul was one that said, hey, I became as a Jew to the Jews, I became as a Greek to the Greeks, for though I'm free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all, that I may win the more. I've become all things to all men. But it wasn't just for empathy's sake. Paul didn't say, I became a Jew to the Jews so I could be a Jew. Or I became a Gentile to the Gentile to comfort the Gentiles. No, he said that I might by all means save some. Paul wasn't just about empathy for empathy's sake. He wasn't about people's feelings, though he did care about people's feelings. He did love people. But he said the most important thing is that they come to know the truth of Jesus Christ. That's what the mission was. And in a world that, again, puts radical empathy on the pedestal and says, well, this is how you show love. This is how you show people that you care about them. You just say, whatever you say goes, and I'm going to listen to whatever you say. That's not the solution. That's not the cure. And so the question then is, what is the Christian response when it comes to this debate between sympathy and empathy? Well, first we want to say this. Christ's love leaves no room for apathy. You know, with every issue, you kind of have ditches on either side that you want to watch out for. And again, we've talked a lot tonight about this ditch of radical empathy, the world pushing us to say, no, you have to be accepting of everyone, or you're going to commit ideological murder of them. Well, the ditch on the other side is apathy, where we say, I don't care in the least about this person. I think a lot of times about the issue of the LGBT movement, right? Same-sex attracted individuals. And I believe in the past the church has been guilty to some extent of the sin of apathy when it comes to these people. These people exist in the world, and we maybe the apathetic, we say they know it's wrong, they know it's evil, they know it's a sin. I don't understand why they don't just do right and come to church. Well, they know where they're going. That's apathy, right? Empathy would be to go to these people and say, you know what? Your attraction, that's how God made you. That's the person that you are. That's how you're meant to be, and so I'm going to affirm you in that. You do whatever you want. God loves you just the way that you are. That's radical empathy when it comes to that person. What does sympathy look like for someone who is attracted to the same sex? Am I going to hurt with that person? If they're struggling and they go, I want to serve God, but I have these feelings, these emotions, I don't know what to do with them, is that a hurtful thing? That would be very confusing. And there are many young people and older people alike that are confused by those things. They have issues. They have problems within themselves, within their emotions. And sympathy for us is going, hey, I know you're hurting. I want to comfort you. I want to show you that there's a better way. But do we ever give in and say your way's right? No. That's going past that sympathy border into empathy, going into the ditch, and then we're both led blind, aren't we? We're both at fault. But we can't be apathetic. We can't be apathetic and not care about people. I think about Romans chapter 12, verse 10 and 11. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, and honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. As Christians, our option can never be, well, I'm just not going to care. If I care so much that I do wrong or I go into error, well, I'm just not going to care at all. No, we must care about people, and we'll always have that tension between wanting to make people happy, wanting to help people with hurt feelings, wanting to make them feel better, and realizing that sometimes the best thing we can do is hurt them by telling them the truth, right? But no matter what, that truth-telling has to come from a place of love. That's who Jesus was, and that's who he calls us to be as well. Second, empathy can never be untethered from truth. No matter how much empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it, that compassion we have from another person, it can never be untethered from truth. I think about Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. As Jesus was sending out the disciples into Judea to preach, he said, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." I always find it funny that Jesus told people to be like snakes. Kind of anti-biblical as you usually think about it. But be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. That means I don't go around trying to hurt people. I don't go around trying to hurt people's feelings and make them cry and make them think, well, you're going to hell. That's not what I'm about as a person or as a Christian. But at the same time, I have to be wise as a serpent to know not everybody who's hurting is hurting for the right reason. Not everybody who's hurting has their best interest in mind. Sometimes they need help. And another thing I'll say is this is not a quick thing, is it? These people that need help, I can't just go in with my Bible and whack them over the head and say, you're fixed now, why don't you just do right? It's a process. It takes a lot of time. Sympathy is patient and long-suffering and fervent and willing to wait people out until they get to where they need to be to receive that help. But we even though we want to be harmless, we cannot throw out wisdom. We cannot throw out truth. I think about Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Note all the clauses that Paul puts in here. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, skip the underline first, in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. He's ultimately going to be telling them, hey, you go do this with another person. If you see someone overtaken by a trespass, you need to have a spirit of gentleness. You need to consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. But ultimately, you do what? You restore such a one. If someone's off the path, what's the ultimate goal? Get them back on the path. Are you going to do it in the spirit of gentleness? Yes, you are. Are you going to do it with humility, knowing that you also could fall into temptation and get off the path? Yes, you will. But the goal can never be to say, I'm not going to hurt that person's feelings because they're off the path. That can't be it. That's what radical empathy wants, but sympathy says, I know what's best for them is to get back on the path, even if it's going to hurt in the process. Restore such a one. We have to keep ourselves tethered to the truth. And then finally, and I know this is unlegible here, but we must work in service of the chief comforter and the sympathetic high priest. And what I mean by this, when we come into a situation where someone's hurting, they're hurting, we're the comforter, but we're not really the comforter ourselves, are we? There's always that third person, and that third person is Jesus Christ. I can't help the person at the funeral home who's down on their knees saying, my life is totally out of whack. Everything's been taken from me. I have nothing left. I can't be the ultimate comforter for that person who's lost their job or lost their family or any number of other things, but Jesus Christ is. He's the chief comforter. He's the sympathetic high priest. And when I'm going to people, I do it in the humility going, no, I know I can't fix all your problems. I know that I can't get down on your level, and I can't make everything right in your mind. I can't make everything right with the hurt that you have, but I know the person who can. Jesus Christ is the one. 2 Corinthians 4:5, for we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your bondservants for Jesus' sake. We have to have the attitude and the mind of a servant. We're a servant to the people. We're a servant to the LGBT person. We're a servant to the person that's hurting over here, that's so confused, that doesn't know their left hand from their right. We're servants to those people because our job is to bring them to Jesus Christ. Not to fix them. We can't fix anybody. But Jesus can fix anybody. And that's who we have to bring them to. So what's the final idea here? It's just this: beware empathy without truth. That's what the world is peddling. That's what people are being pushed toward. This morning, Brother Ronald preached on that idea of, have you ever been moody? You know, you have these emotions that come up, and are your emotions going to drive you? And it's often been proven emotions are a terrible driver. Emotions are a necessary passenger in our lives. We're always going to have emotions, and they're wonderful. But emotions are a bad driver. We don't want our own emotions to drive us in the wrong direction. This lesson pairs well with it because it's this: we can't let the emotions of other people drive us off the path of truth when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's not loving to them. That's not what they need. No, we must cling to truth. We must show that sympathy and that compassion, but don't let anyone shame you into saying that true love and true empathy would be telling that person that you're exactly right the way that you are. Because none of us are exactly right the way we are we? We all have sin in our lives, and we all need Jesus to make that right for us. Tonight, maybe you need Jesus to forgive you of your sins. Maybe you're not a Christian. I know most here are. But if you're not a Christian, you can be baptized into Christ, and Jesus, the great physician, he's the one that can fix you. He can fix you of the problems that no one else can. But if you are a Christian tonight, as most of us are, maybe you've fallen into that sin. Maybe you've gotten down to that low place. Maybe you've been looking for comfort for whatever struggles or temptations you're going through, but ultimately you know that the answer is turning back to Jesus Christ himself and letting him comfort